In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Every child in the Western world learns this rhyme before they can even tie their shoes. Christopher Columbus, the brave Italian explorer who set sail from Spain, crossed an unknown ocean, and discovered an entirely new world for humanity. The man whose boldness changed the course of history. The man who proved the earth was round when everyone else thought it was flat. The man so celebrated that the United States gave him his own national holiday. A hero, a pioneer, a legend. You know this story. It was the first history lesson you were ever taught. Every word of it was built around one single event. October 12th, 1492. The day Columbus discovered America. There's just one small problem. He never did. Not even close. He didn't discover it. He didn't name it. And he spent the rest of his life insisting he had found somewhere else entirely. Other than that great story, let's be very precise about what actually happened on October 12th, 1492. Columbus made landfall in the Bahamas, not the mainland of America, not the United States, not South America, not Central America, the Bahamas, a small island in the Caribbean Sea that the indigenous Lucayan people called Guanahani, which Columbus promptly renamed San Salvador because apparently Guanahani was too hard to put on a flag. For nearly 5 months after that, Columbus explored the Caribbean, the islands of Cuba and Hispaniola before returning to Spain. He never once set foot on the continent of North America. Not in 1492, not in any of his 3 subsequent voyages. He made 4 trips across the Atlantic in 1492, 1493, 1498, and 1502. And in all 4 of them, his stated goal was to find a direct water route to Asia. Asia, not America. He sailed across the Atlantic Ocean looking for Japan, found the Bahamas, and filed it under. Close enough. We have been celebrating that ever since. Columbus was not the first European to reach the Americas, not by 500 years. Leif Erikson landed in North America around AD 1000, nearly 5 centuries before Columbus was even born. For a long time, this was dismissed as Viking myth. Tall tales from people who also believed in sea serpents. Fair enough. But then came 1960, and someone started digging in Newfoundland. At the northern tip of the island of Newfoundland, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a complete 11th century Viking settlement, the earliest confirmed evidence of European presence in North America. This was not a theory. This was not a legend. This was wood, iron, and foundations. Then, in 2021, a study published in Nature, one of the world's most respected scientific journals, used cosmic ray-induced radiocarbon dating to pinpoint the Norse presence in Newfoundland to precisely AD 1021. Not around 1021, not approximately 1021. Precisely. Peer-reviewed, confirmed. Lance Meadows is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized as the first and only confirmed Norse settlement in North America, and the earliest evidence of European settlement in the New World. Columbus arrived 471 years later. So technically, Columbus didn't discover America. He rediscovered it after the world forgot about it for half a millennium. Here is where the story becomes genuinely uncomfortable, because Columbus did not simply stumble into the wrong continent, by honest mistake. He had very specific reasons to insist he was somewhere he was not, and those reasons were financial. In April 1492, Columbus signed a contract with the Spanish crown, known as the Capitulations of Santa Fe. Under this contract, Columbus was promised the title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, the position of Viceroy and Governor of any new lands claimed, and 10% of all revenues from those lands in perpetuity, 10% of everything, forever, for him and all his descendants. That is an extraordinary contract, one for a man whose entire pitch to the Spanish monarchs was essentially, "Give me ships. I think Asia is that way." Ferdinand and Isabella wanted the same things: fame, fortune, and the opportunity to export Catholicism to new lands. Everyone had something to gain. Everyone also had something to lose. Specifically Columbus, if it turned out, he had not found Asia at all, but had instead stumbled onto a massive unknown continent with no spice trade and no silk route, which is of course exactly what happened. So what did Columbus do? When confronted with the mounting evidence that this was definitely not Asia, he did what any reasonable person would do when their entire financial future depended on being right. He just kept insisting he was right. He returned to Spain with small amounts of gold, native birds and plants, presenting them as proof of the richness of the continent he believed to be Asia. He called the indigenous people Indians because he was convinced he had reached the Indies. He called Cuba Juana. He spent years searching the coastline for the passage to the Indian Ocean that he was sure was just around the next bend. Columbus continued to insist until his death in 1506 that the islands of the Caribbean were the eastern edges of Asia, a position he maintained publicly throughout his life. 12 years, 4 voyages, thousands of miles of coastline. That looked nothing like any map of Asia ever drawn, and the man never budged. At some point, this stops being an honest mistake and starts being a very expensive commitment to a story. While Columbus was busy insisting the Caribbean was Japan, another Italian explorer looked at the same coastline and reached a rather different conclusion. His name was Amerigo Vespucci. You may have heard of him. He's the reason the whole place is called America and not Columbia, which for Columbus is the kind of posthumous insult that just keeps giving. In 1503, Vespucci published a booklet entitled Mundus Novus, Latin for New World, containing the first published claim that the lands in the West were an entirely separate continent, not the edges of Asia. He had sailed down the coast of Brazil, looked at the stars, compared notes with other navigators, and concluded, this is simply not Asia. It's too big, too far south, and the stars are completely wrong. The idea of a new world ignited the popular imagination, but it placed Vespucci at odds with Columbus, who still insisted the lands were part of Asia. One man looked at the evidence and told the truth. The other had a 10% royalty deal on the line. In 1507, mapmaker Martin Waldseemüller suggested the newly discovered world be named after Amerigo the Discoverer, and the name America appeared on a map for the first time. Columbus's name appeared nowhere. The Columbus discovered America story did not emerge organically from careful historical scholarship. It was built deliberately, strategically, and relatively recently by people who needed a particular kind of hero for a particular kind of purpose. For most of the centuries after his death, Columbus was not especially celebrated. He died in legal disputes with the Spanish crown, stripped of most of his titles, still arguing about his 10%. Not exactly the statue-worthy figure we ended up with. The real turning point came in 1828, when Washington Irving published a wildly fictionalized biography of Columbus that invented scenes, invented dialogue, and, most infamously, invented the myth that Columbus had to fight to convince people the earth was round. Educated people in 1492 already knew the earth was round. The flat earth story was fabricated in the 19th century and inserted into a 15th century biography. Nobody checked. Then came the final piece of the mythology. In 1937, President Franklin D. Roosevelt proclaimed Columbus Day a national holiday, largely as a result of intense lobbying by the Knights of Columbus, an influential Catholic fraternal organization. The holiday was not born from historical consensus, it was born from politics, a gesture toward Italian American and Catholic communities who needed representation. Columbus was chosen not because history demanded it, but because someone needed a Catholic Italian hero. And Columbus was available. Every version of the Columbus discovered America story contains a logical flaw so enormous that it is genuinely remarkable it survived as long as it did. You cannot discover a place where millions of people already live. That is not discovery. That is showing up unannounced. By the end of the 20th century, the scholarly consensus placed the pre-Columbian population of the Americas at approximately 50 million people, with some historians arguing for 100 million or more. These were not scattered communities. They were complex civilizations, cities, agriculture, astronomy, trade networks, legal systems, history stretching back thousands of years, before anyone in Europe had any idea this continent existed. When Columbus arrived, he did not find an empty land, waiting to be named. He found a continent full of people who had been there for roughly 15,000 years and were, understandably, not expecting company. Columbus wrote in his journal that the indigenous people would make fine servants and could easily be made Christians, noting they appeared to have no religion. He had been on the island for approximately one afternoon at that point. History is full of confident conclusions, drawn from very little information. So let us state clearly what the historical records actually shows. Columbus landed in the Bahamas in 1492, not on the American continent. He explored the Caribbean across 4 voyages and never once reached North America. He believed he had found Asia, said so publicly until his death, and had strong financial incentives to keep saying it. Leif Erikson and the Norse were in North America approximately 500 years before Columbus, confirmed by archaeological evidence dated to AD 1021 and recognized by UNESCO. Amerigo Vespucci, not Columbus, was the first European to correctly identify the landmass as a new continent entirely separate from Asia. The continent was named after Vespucci. The holiday was created 445 years after the voyage, for political reasons that had very little to do with accurate history and the flat earth story that made Columbus seem even more heroic, completely fabricated in the 19th century. So to summarize, Columbus did not discover America, did not reach America, named the wrong people incorrectly, died believing he had found something he hadn't. And the holiday named after him was a political invention, Other than all of that, with remarkable legacy.